Story 1, I'm not a writer, that's for sure. I don't even know how to start. Maybe I should say that I just need to tell someone, because I can't stay silent any longer. I don't know who else to talk to about this. And to be honest, I'm afraid no one will understand. Maybe I'm just crazy, or maybe there's something wrong with us. Emma and I have been together for 4 years. We live together, everything seems fine, but somehow it's not. We have arguments, like everyone else. We're not perfect, are we? Little things that aren't worth discussing, but they add up. Sometimes I think that if we just didn't try to analyze everything, but just lived, it would be easier. But no, all these little misunderstandings, these little grievances, they all add up and lead to something bigger. For example, I can't just leave something unfinished, and Emma always says that I promise one thing and then forget. And that's how it happens. Laundry, dirty dishes, forgotten little things. Everything that can usually be annoying when you live with someone and not always in a good mood. But something began to change. We were listening to a podcast once where we were talking about the importance of controlling our emotions and understanding each other. I don't remember exactly what it was, but the idea stuck in my head. Emma and I discussed it and came to a strange decision: to write down our fights. Yes, it sounds a little weird, but we decided that it would help us understand what was really going on when we argued. It wasn't to blame anyone later, no. We just wanted to hear what we were actually saying, not what each of us made up in our heads after a conflict. I thought it was just a silly thing to figure out the little things, but it kind of worked. In the beginning, when we were listening to the tapes, I really felt like I was starting to get a better sense of what was really wrong with our communication. Sometimes I would hear things I would never say, and it would surprise me. I thought it was just this weird effect where you don't really seem to be paying attention to something, and then suddenly it comes out. And so, in those moments, it started to feel like we were on the right track. But after a while, I realized that something was starting to go wrong. A couple of months passed, and one day we had a big fight. I'd forgotten to change the laundry again, as usual, and it had led to another disappointment for Emma. She said I always did that, and I just got defensive. It was a stupid reaction, and I knew she probably had a right to be a little annoyed. But I couldn't stop. I started arguing, making excuses, accusing her of always picking on the little things. Things quickly got out of hand. I set my phone to record, not thinking it would be a big deal. I was just doing what Emma and I had always thought was a good idea, recording and then going over it. The fight lasted about 20 minutes, but it wasn't that surprising. We'd had fights before. It seemed like nothing special. The next day we sat down to listen to the tape again. I didn't think anything would change. But when we started listening to it, it was completely different from how I remembered it. It wasn't a normal recording. It was my voice, but it sounded strange, like I wasn't in the state I should have been in. I always thought that when I was angry and tense, I spoke harshly, emotionally. But here I was calm, very calm. My voice was even cold. I spoke as if I didn't care what was going on, as if I didn't care about these fights. But what was even stranger was the way Emma sounded. I knew her voice by heart. She had never spoken with such contempt. But on the recording, she sounded different. I heard a sharpness in her words that I had never heard in real life. It wasn't just irritation or anger. It was more than that. It was like she hated me, even though she had never said anything like that. She said something I still can't get out of my head. You're just like your father. Weak. Emma never mentioned my father. We never talked about it. I thought maybe I was wrong, but no, the recording was right. I listened to it over and over again, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I tried to justify it, to find some explanation. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe I accidentally opened the wrong record, but no. This was exactly what we recorded. This was the same record. I wanted to forget about it. I thought it was stress, fatigue, something wrong with my perception. Maybe a memory glitch. But no, I couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong. Why did her voice sound so alien? A few days later, we were arguing again. This time, I played the recording again from the beginning, not thinking about what was going to happen next. I just did what I had already done. But when we listened to the second recording, I realized that it had only gotten worse. It was even stranger. My voice sounded arrogant, condescending, like I was on top and she was somewhere below. Helpless. I didn't talk like that. We never communicated like that. And she, instead of being angry or defensive, sounded broken. Like she was empty inside, like she didn't believe in our conversations. As I turned up the volume on the recording, I heard a background noise. At first I thought it was just static, but when I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't a coincidence. It was like whispering, breathing, like someone was nearby. But it was just the two of us. No TV, no street noise, just silence and this sound I couldn't explain. Emma left the next day, said she needed space. She went to her sister's, and since then she has hardly communicated with me. I became afraid, and I didn't understand why I suddenly began to feel this fear. Everything that was happening seemed so strange, absurd, and at the same time somehow dark and inexplicable. A few days after Emma left, I sat alone in our house, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. My mind was filled with questions, but no answers. I didn't know what had happened between us, why she had left, why I felt like something was wrong with us. Every time I tried to remember what had happened on the tape, I was overcome by a strange sense of unease. The whole situation seemed unbearably tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there had actually been more to it than just a fight. Emma didn't text me. Usually, when we had a disagreement, We would still exchange short messages to check in on each other. But this time was completely different. She didn't answer my messages, she didn't call, and her sister didn't give me any news either. All I knew was that she was far away, and that left me completely alone with a lot of uncertainty. I kept thinking about the tape we had listened to together. Every word, every sentence on it left me with more and more questions. Was it really Emma, the one I had been living with for all these years? It was her reaction, her voice, but it sounded like it wasn't her. I tried to justify it, to find some explanation. Maybe it was just the effect of the tape. Maybe she was in such an emotional state that she didn't realize what she was saying. But how to explain the fact that I sounded like I was someone else on the tape? I couldn't find a logical explanation. That evening I sat at my desk, listening to the recording over and over again, trying to hear something new in it that might explain what was happening. I sped it up, slowed it down, stopped it, rewinded it, but each listen only brought more questions. At some point, I began to notice strange things that I hadn't noticed before. Background sounds. I couldn't tell what it was exactly, but when I turned up the volume on the recording, I heard faint breathing, footsteps, like someone was in the room, even though I knew it was just the two of us. I checked several times to see if the air conditioner or fan was on, but they weren't working. The room was completely silent. I played the recording again, trying to figure out what was going on, but all I could hear was this strange breathing. I felt my chest go cold. It was too much. Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe I was making things up just to explain to myself what I couldn't understand. The next few days passed in the same anxiety. I couldn't stop. I checked my phone 100 times, not knowing what to look for. I returned to the recording again and again and listened to it, as if hoping that at some point I would hear something that would explain everything. But nothing happened. Just noise and this strange voice that was neither hers nor mine. Then, a few days ago, I was checking my recording folder. I didn't want to, but some urge was stronger. And then I noticed there was another recording. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was from the night Emma left. The folder where I kept all my recordings was empty, except for this new unidentified recording. I was sure I hadn't recorded anything that night. I hadn't touched my phone at all when she left. It was impossible. I opened the recording, feeling my hands begin to shake slightly. My mind couldn't function properly anymore. I thought maybe it was a mistake, some kind of system glitch, but my gut told me it wasn't. It was something more. When I started listening, my voice was on the recording again. It sounded just like the recordings I had heard before, but everything was different. The sounds I heard weren't the same. My words were hard, cold, and I spoke as if I were someone I didn't know. I tried to stop the recording to turn it off, but it kept playing. And that's when I heard it. This voice I had never heard before. I couldn't make out all the words, but the phrase he said was clear. Now we are all in the know. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what was happening, but this wasn't normal. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rising, and every sound on the recording seemed more ominous than the last. It wasn't just inexplicable, it was terrifying. I tried to turn off the phone, but even after I put it down, I kept hearing this voice in my head, and all I could think was, we all know now. But what the hell did that mean? I felt panic rising in me. I didn't know what to do. What was happening to us? Why did this voice appear? I was afraid to go to sleep because I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew one thing: this couldn't be a coincidence. There was something supernatural about it, and it was terrifying. With each passing day, I felt myself losing control. Not only was the situation with the recordings not being resolved, it was becoming more and more strange and frightening. I couldn't believe what was happening. I couldn't understand how it was possible that the voice I was hearing was so alien that every word on the recording seemed not mine, not Emmy's, but someone else. The voice I heard on the last recording was far more sinister than anything that had come before. I tried to rationalize it all. Was this just a side effect of stress? Had I gotten too caught up in this podcast about therapy techniques and started taking the recordings of our fights too seriously? But no, something was wrong. I felt it in my entire being, and it wasn't going away. It was getting stronger with each passing day. The first night, after I found the new recording, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to focus on anything but what could be hidden behind the recording. I got up, went to the kitchen, poured myself some water, but I didn't feel any relief. I was haunted by this question all the time. What was happening to me? Why couldn't I get out of this vicious circle? In the morning, I opened my phone again and started checking the entries. My hand shook as I scrolled through the folder, as if I didn't know what was waiting for me. By the time I got to that entry, I was covered in a cold sweat. This wasn't a mistake, not a system glitch. Something strange was happening, and I was becoming more and more sure of it. But I still couldn't figure out what it was. I listened to the recording again, and the more I listened, the more terrified I became. The voices on the recording still sounded as strange as before, but now I noticed something new. At the end of the recording, when I thought it was all over, I suddenly heard a lingering sound. It wasn't breathing or footsteps, it was a sound like the rustling of clothing, as if someone was moving near the microphone. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Fear and doubt filled me, and I decided that I had to find an explanation for all of this. I couldn't rely on my feelings anymore, I had to figure it out, find a rational explanation for what was happening. I decided to call Emma. Although she hadn't responded to my messages in a while, I tried anyway. I hoped that talking to her would help clarify what was going on. Maybe this was all some kind of mind game or just stress. But her phone was not answering. I left a message, but there was no response. This only increased my anxiety. A few days later, I went back to my plan. I decided that I needed to talk to someone who could help me. But who could I trust in such a situation? I couldn't share all this with my friends. They would just laugh. Even if I did, who would believe the story? So I decided to take the final step to look for help online. I went to several forums and wrote about my experience, hoping that someone at least understood what I was talking about. At some point, I saw several posts in which people described something similar. But what really alarmed me was the fact that those who wrote mentioned one word: obsession. They talked about how the paranormal phenomena they were experiencing were similar to what was happening to me. But what really scared me was the word obsession. In my case, there was something else going on. Something strange that I couldn't understand. It wasn't just paranormal, it was like something was watching me, observing. And these recordings weren't random. Someone or something was creating them. And these voices I was hearing weren't mine or Emma's. They were someone else, invisible, unknowable. I didn't know how to deal with it. Every time I heard the recording, I felt like something huge and dark was growing in that house. It was unbearable. One night I decided I was going to go look for answers. I had to figure out what was going on. I couldn't sit back any longer, not understanding what was going on in my house, in my life. I packed my things, grabbed my phone, and went to see an old friend. He was one of the few people who could figure out what was going on. If anyone could help me, it was him. My heart was beating fast, as if I was on the threshold of something scary and unknown. I didn't know where this path would lead me, but I was ready to find answers no matter what. It had been a few days since Emma had left, and all that time I was trying to figure out what was going on. I sat in my room, listening to the tapes over and over. Nothing seemed to change. But every time I heard those voices, every time I heard that strange whisper, I felt anxiety creeping up on me. I couldn't figure out what was happening. I felt like I was going crazy. Emma was right. I needed space, but I didn't know what to do with it. I was trapped. Everything stayed the same. Time kept moving forward, and I still couldn't find an explanation for what was happening. There was a lot of work to do, but I couldn't focus anymore. Every moment was filled with this strange feeling that I was missing something, that I was surrounded by something unknown and frightening. I didn't know what to look for. All I knew was that those recordings on my phone were still there, and they continued to torment me. When I realized I needed to at least try to figure this out, I went to Jason. We didn't talk much, but I knew I could trust his logic. I couldn't share this with other friends or family. I felt like they wouldn't understand. Jason was the only one who could look at this as a problem and try to find a rational explanation, but even he couldn't help me. His suggestion to go to a specialist seemed like the most logical thing to do. I made an appointment with the local experts, hoping they could explain how this could have happened. But I was already starting to doubt that they could give me the answers I needed. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I sat in the lab, listening to them explain possible glitches in the software or recording errors, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a waste of time. Every time they explained that it could just be a software glitch, I saw their faces and tried to believe their words. But deep down, I knew that something else was going on. Maybe I was out of my mind, maybe it was just stress, but I couldn't shake the feeling that none of this was an accident. As I walked home, I felt even more empty. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that this nightmare would not end until I unraveled it completely. And although I was beginning to understand that this might be connected to something bigger than I could imagine, I didn't know where to start. I didn't know who to turn to. A few days passed and I continued to listen to the recordings. The voices became stranger and the whispers grew louder. Sometimes it seemed as if they were following me, that I could hear them wherever I was. I began to avoid listening to these files, but every time I listened to them, I felt even worse. When I finally decided to check the entries again, I noticed that one of them was new. It had been added to the phone the night Emma left. I couldn't figure out how that had happened. I hadn't recorded anything that night. I hadn't touched the phone, but it was there, and I couldn't help but listen to her. The sound was familiar but different. It wasn't quite what I expected. I was hearing the conversation with Emma again in the recording, but this time it was distorted. My voice was cold, hard. I was saying things I couldn't say in real life. She, in turn, sounded like she was filled with some kind of hopelessness, like she wasn't the person I knew. There was no aggression in her voice like before. She was broken, like she wasn't there. And there were those whispers again. I turned up the volume and realized it wasn't just noise. It was footsteps, or rather, something was getting closer, getting louder and louder until it filled the space. I felt goosebumps on my skin. I felt cold, and I didn't know how to react. This was more than just a recording error. This was something evil. The voice I heard at the end of the recording wasn't mine, and it wasn't Emmy's. It was a voice I'd never heard before. It said, "We all know now." I didn't know what that meant, but it made my heart skip a beat. In that moment, I knew these weren't just my fears. This was something real. I tried to forget it, but it wouldn't let me go. Every night I woke up with nightmares. I couldn't sleep. I checked my phone over and over, hoping it was just a mistake. that one of us was playing a joke on me. But every time I opened those records, I couldn't find an explanation. I was on the edge. I felt like the world was falling apart around me. But what scared me most was not what was happening, but that I could not find anyone who could help me. A few more days passed. Time seemed to slow down. It seemed like I was reliving the same moment over and over again, going over the thoughts in my head, trying to find some kind of explanation for what was happening. But nothing came. Emma had not returned. The phone was not silent, but each message from her seemed more and more distant. I no longer knew what to think. I did not know what to do with what was happening in my house, with what was happening to us. Every time I tried to talk to someone about what I was going through, I couldn't find the words. It seemed too strange, too foreign. I started to feel like I was going crazy. I had no answers, only questions that baffled me. I listened to the tapes over and over again, and each time they got worse. I didn't understand what was wrong with them. This wasn't just a confusing distortion. There was something more, something that shouldn't have been there. When I got home from another meeting with Jason, I felt that strange coldness gathering in the room again. I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. I felt like someone was watching me, like there was a presence nearby. It came over me whenever I was alone. Even when I turned on the lights, it didn't go away. I checked everything around me, checked the doors and windows, but I found nothing. Nothing except that nasty feeling of unease that wouldn't go away. I knew I had to do something. But what? What would help? I didn't know who to talk to or who to turn to. Every time I tried to force myself to take action, I felt my strength draining away. This wasn't just a relationship problem. It was something bigger. And with each passing day, I realized I couldn't solve this on my own. I couldn't figure out what was happening because it was beyond my understanding. That night, I listened to the tapes again, and there was that strange voice again. A voice that wasn't mine or Emmy's. It was alien, it was unfamiliar, and everything it said was mysterious, like it knew something I didn't. It always showed up in the most unexpected places, like it had been watching us all this time. Every time I heard it, I felt worse. I was scared, but I couldn't stop listening. I felt like I needed more information to figure out what it was. Why was it recorded? Why was I being shown all this? Who could have done this? And then, in one of the recordings, I heard something strange. In the middle of a conversation, when everything seemed normal, as if there was no threat, the voice said, "You know you can't avoid this." These words sounded like a death sentence. And at that moment, I realized that all of this could be part of something much bigger than I imagined. I began to think that this was not just a coincidence, not a mistake. I could no longer hope that all of this would disappear on its own. I began to think about what to do next, and how it was possible to return to normal life after all this. I remembered Emma often saying that she felt like something was wrong at home, but she always put it off as something minor. Now, I couldn't help but think that she might be right. Maybe it wasn't just stress or relationship problems. Maybe there was something going on with both of us, something we couldn't figure out. But here's the question: what? What was that? I lay in the darkness and didn't know how to go on living. I had no solution. I didn't know how to stop this and put everything back in its place. But I knew I couldn't stay in this house. I couldn't continue living in this darkness and this anxiety. Emma, what happened to her? Where was she? Every time I asked myself these questions, I felt worse. I realized that I couldn't find the answers. And the more I thought about it, the more it became clear to me that I hadn't been alone all this time. Someone had been with us. Someone had been watching us. What if all this is not just a coincidence? I couldn't stay in this house any longer. I couldn't stay here in this place that had become alien. And I didn't know exactly what would happen if I didn't find the answer to these questions. Story 2. When I think about my childhood, the first thing that comes to mind is not the happy moments that most people have. It's not morning walks with my parents or family holidays. No, I remember dark corners, fragments of memories that would have been better if I had never entered my head. My childhood was deprived of normal care and love. Instead, I was part of an alien and distorted reality in which violence was the norm and fear was a constant companion. My father came home when I was 7. He came back from Iraq. He was a soldier, and he came back different than he had been before. I remember looking at him with curiosity, but it wasn't the curiosity a child feels when they meet a parent after a long absence. It was more like fear. His eyes were empty, expressionless, as if he had left his soul somewhere out there, in the sands of that distant war. He was someone I never wanted him to be. There was nothing familiar in his gaze. He was a different person. He had changed. His hands were hard and big like iron claws. Every time he looked at me, I felt the air around me grow heavy. He didn't say much. He rarely spoke at all. And when his words did come out, they were sharp, broken, as if he couldn't find the right words. And when he spoke to my mother, I heard something cold in his voice, something cruel that made me cringe. My mother tried to control herself. I don't know how she dealt with it with him. She never talked about it, but I saw her changing. She became more and more silent, withdrawn. Sometimes I would see her sitting in the kitchen, looking out the window and drinking. She wasn't always a drinker, but with his return it became almost the norm. Every night she would open a bottle and not let it go until the morning. I didn't know how to help. I was little, too little to understand what was happening. But my father, his aggression was unpredictable. Sometimes it was in the cruel words he said. Sometimes in the look in his eyes that made me tremble. But most often when he was angry, he would just hit me. But he would hit me like I was nothing, like it was natural. I couldn't understand why he did that, why he hated us. Mother and me. As I got older, I began to understand. I understood that he came from the war with invisible wounds. He was broken. I didn't know what to call it then, but now I understand. Post-traumatic stress disorder. That was what he brought with him. That was what destroyed us. I always hid from him, hid in my own world, full of fears and nightmares. I often went to my grandmother's for the night. It was peaceful there. He wasn't there. But when I returned home, that crazy reality began again. I quickly learned to be quiet, to stay in the shadows. If he didn't see me, he wasn't angry. I learned to avoid his gaze, learned not to do anything that could anger him. My mother once told me that he had once been a good man. Maybe she believed it herself, but I couldn't. I couldn't imagine what he had been like before he came back from the war. I wasn't interested. I only saw him, who beat, who screamed, who sat at the table with a bottle in his hand, who stared into space and didn't notice us. I saw his angry eyes, his hands covered in scars, and I understood that he would never be. He was already dead inside. I was 8 when I started to realize that this wasn't life anymore. I remember sitting in my room and praying for him to go away. I prayed for him to leave again, for him to never be in our house again. I didn't know that would ever happen. He didn't leave. He stayed. Every day was worse than the last. I learned to hide from him. When he was home, I sat quietly, hiding in a corner. I avoided his every look, his every move. I didn't want to be near him, and I couldn't understand why my mother didn't leave him. Why she didn't go away, didn't leave, didn't take me with her. We lived in this hell, and she continued to drink. It was as if she had forgotten that we had a way out, but she stayed anyway. We stayed. I didn't know how to survive in a house like that, but somehow I learned. I learned not to think. I learned to forget. I learned to lock everything I didn't like in one big box to forget. But even now, years later, that box is still not closed. It opens sometimes when I find something that reminds me of that time. It happens when I smell alcohol or when I see a stranger with empty eyes. These moments bring me back to the world I was in before. Now that I'm 30, I try to move on, but I can't forget. Sometimes in lonely moments when the darkness in the room becomes thick and heavy, I feel it coming back. And I find myself back in my childhood, among those shattered memories that I tried so hard to forget. But I understand now that this is not something that can be simply forgotten. It will remain with me, like an imprint that cannot be erased. Ever since I left home, I thought I could start a new life. I moved to a big city, got a job, made new friends. Everything seemed to be back to normal. Everything was supposed to be back to normal. But despite all the efforts I made to escape that world, I always felt the past pulling me back. It pulled me along like invisible hands that I couldn't shake off. I often woke up at night, feeling that something was wrong. I knew that sleep was just a temporary escape, and every time I closed my eyes, I seemed to return to that room again, that dark, musty atmosphere. I remembered the moments when I woke up at night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, when I hid under the covers, hoping that his gaze would not fall on me. I was so attached to those fears that had formed in my childhood that even in my adult nights I could not shake off this feeling. One day, a few years after I left home, I was visiting friends when one of them told me a story. It was about a man who had suffered severe trauma as a child and now could not get rid of visions from his past. It was a strange story that made me think. Had I become like that too? Had these visions become my new reality, my new state? I remembered how, as a child, every sound could make me tremble with fear. A rustle in the hallway, a creaking door, the sound of footsteps, all this instantly transported me to that reality, where every moment was full of danger. And now, years later, I began to hear these sounds again. They were quiet, barely noticeable, but I knew they were there. I heard them in the silence of the night, when it seemed that no one was in the room. These were the same steps that I heard as a child, when my father came to my world to take me into his shadows. When I lived with him, it seemed like these sounds were just part of the night. But now that I was in a different city, in a different apartment, I couldn't ignore them. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old house, that these were just noises left by time. But I knew it wasn't. It wasn't just noise, it was something else. It was something that followed me, not leaving me alone. Then I decided that I had to go back to my hometown. I wanted to find answers that would help me understand what these voices were, what shadows were following me. I wasn't sure if I would find anything useful there, but I thought that maybe if I went back, I would understand everything. I felt that if I didn't go back, I would be stuck with this feeling forever. Returning to the city, I found myself in the same place where I once lived. I stood in front of those old buildings, those courtyards that had once been my world. There was nothing new here. Everything was in its place. But now I saw these places differently. They were filled with memories, the very memories that I had tried to forget for so long. I walked up to the old house we lived in. It looked just like it had when I was a child, only now it was empty, abandoned. The sunlight fell on the old brick walls, but something about the light was different. It was cold, dim, as if the house itself was dead. I stood in front of it, and at some point it seemed to me that I felt its presence again. I felt a shadow, like a hand that had once reached out to me, touching me again. I closed my eyes, trying to push the feeling away. I don't know what it was that drew me here. It was more than just a desire to see old places. It was like a pull that couldn't be explained. I opened my eyes and noticed that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what it was, but it seemed like there was someone standing in the window of the old house. A shadow, a human shadow that looked like a trace from the past. My heart started beating faster and I felt cold sweat on my forehead. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stood there looking at that window and it was hard to breathe. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what it was. Maybe it was my memories. Maybe it was just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was following me. Something was close, and it wouldn't let me go. And in that moment, I realized that these weren't just past experiences. There was something more. Something that was haunting me, invisible but tangible. I turned and walked back to the car, but the feeling of someone watching me wouldn't leave me. It was all so familiar, so unreal. I drove away, but even in the car I could feel that gaze piercing me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. All I knew was that the shadows I'd tried to forget were coming back, and they weren't going to go away. Returning to my hometown did not give me the relief I expected. I thought that if I saw all these places again, they would stop being so scary and mysterious. I thought I could put an end to this issue and leave the past behind, but it turned out that it does not let go so easily. After I left home, I tried to forget everything that had happened. All those nights when I woke up to the sound of footsteps, to rustling in the dark, when he stood by my bed and I couldn't move. I had locked all those memories in my mind, but now they were spilling out. The shadows of the past were clear again, like never before. I returned to the city, and even went to the house, which stood empty. I was afraid to go in, but some inexplicable push inside me made me do it. My heart was beating like crazy, and I, trying not to turn around, walked along the dark corridors of the old house. Each step seemed heavy, each rustle familiar. I was not alone. The windows were covered with dust and dirt, and the light barely penetrated into the room. Desolation reigned here. The wind whistled in the cracks of the doors, and the floors creaked with every step. I approached my old room, the very one where all these terrible visions began, and reached for the door handle. Only then did I notice something moving in the corner, something dark and indistinct, barely visible. I froze in place, unable to move a step. My fingers felt the cold metal of the handle, and I did not know what frightened me more, what I saw or what I felt, as if the room was alive, as if it waiting for me. The door creaked open and I walked in. My old room looked exactly the same as before, but somehow it was different, as if the years had caught it by surprise, as if it was frozen in time, unable to move on. I remembered those nights when I woke up to strange sounds and anxious footsteps, when it seemed like someone was nearby, and then I noticed that there were fresh footprints on the floor, thin, slightly damp, as if someone had just walked across the room. I looked down, and a feeling of fear rose inside me. These footprints could not have been just random. They led to an old closet. I stepped towards it, feeling the tension build and my heart begin to beat faster. As soon as I opened the closet door, there was nothing in front of me except some old clothes and a few items I had left there years ago. But I noticed something strange peeking out through the crack between the shelves. It was a corner of paper, old, faded paper. I carefully took it out and opened it. It was a photograph, an old black and white picture of my father sitting in a chair, a dark expression on his face. I was stunned. I didn't remember ever seeing this photo. I didn't even know it existed. Why was it here, in my room, after all these years? Suddenly I heard a sound like a quiet rustling. Something changed in the air. I felt the cold go down to my bones. It was impossible. I stood up and quickly went to the window. There was nothing there. An empty courtyard, covered in dark night, silent and gloomy. But when I looked back, I felt someone standing next to me again. I turned around and saw a silhouette in the corner. This person looked like the one I saw as a child, but now he was old. His body was hunched over, and his face was more blurred, almost non-existent. It was the same man, the same little man who had once appeared to me in the window, watching me. He stood by the door, his long fingers reaching out to me, and his gaze was empty, as if not of this world. He did not move, did not stir. He just stood there, and I could not look away. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. My whole body was frozen with fear. He was here again. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I stood there paralyzed, not knowing how to react. At that moment, I felt my legs give way and I fell to the floor, trying to tear myself away from that gaze. But before I could do anything, I heard footsteps coming towards me. I looked up and he was gone. The silence returned, but something remained in the air. Something I couldn't understand, but it haunted me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. My consciousness brought me back to reality, to the moment when I found myself on the street again. I closed my eyes, trying to get rid of the image of this little man, but his shadow still followed me, disappearing only with the coming of morning. With each day I spent in this place, I felt my strength fading. The walls that once seemed familiar and safe now weighed on me. I tried to return to my normal life, to continue going to work, to meet with friends, but something was constantly pulling me back. The same question kept ringing in my head. Why did he show up again? The little man, I didn't know what to call him, but I always felt that he wasn't just a vision or a figment of my imagination. He was real, and his presence was as inevitable as the rain or the night. He wasn't just a nightmare, he was part of my life, part of a past I was trying to forget. I thought he had disappeared as I grew older, but now I realized he never leaves. He was always watching over me, always somewhere nearby. I sat in my apartment, on the edge of my bed, trying to focus on something that would distract me. I checked my phone for messages, but I didn't want to answer them. People always try to be helpful when you're feeling down, but that only makes it worse. I closed my eyes and tried to tell myself, you're an adult. You're just paranoid. These are all traumas, these are all fears from the past. But what if it's not? What if it's all true? I closed my eyes, trying to push these thoughts away, and when I opened them again, I immediately noticed that something had changed. The room was not as I had left it. In the center stood my old toy horse, which I had once left on the shelf. I picked it up and remembered how I had played with it as a child. It was one of the few objects that I could call familiar and safe. But even this toy seemed different now. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, and its eyes, when I looked at them, seemed filled with some invisible shadow. I turned away, knowing that in the next moment I would again be overcome by that feeling of fear. But as soon as I turned around, I felt that there was someone in the room. I could not see him, but I knew. He was standing in the corner, in the darkness, as always. I quickly stood up and, ignoring what I was feeling, moved towards the door. My legs barely obeyed me. I opened the door, and suddenly my eyes rested on the mirror that hung in the hallway. My gaze lingered on it, as if something invisible was forcing me to look. I saw my reflection, but it was not mine. It was the figure of a woman standing right behind me. She was wearing a white dress, and her face was covered in a dark mass, as if someone had deliberately blurred her features. I couldn't believe my eyes. This couldn't be possible. My heart was pounding wildly, and my brain refused to accept what was happening. I quickly jumped back, closing my eyes, trying not to think about what I had just seen. But when I opened them again, the mirror was empty. This was not an illusion. This was reality, cruel and unbelievable. I did not know what was happening, but one thing was clear to me. I could not stay in this place any longer. I ran out of the apartment, not thinking about what I was doing, just to get away from this shadow, this ominous presence that would not stop following me. I went down the stairs, but as I stood at the door, I realized that I did not know where to go. Where would I be safe? Where could I hide from what was following me? It was dark outside and the air was cold, as it always was at night. I felt my pulse quicken. It was a feeling that wouldn't leave me. A feeling that someone was standing right behind me, watching, following. I turned around but saw no one, just emptiness, but I knew he was there. I started walking down the streets, trying to focus on the world around me, on simple things. But all of these things seemed distant and alien. I was passing familiar places, past the very house where it all began. It was the very yard where I first noticed him. The shadow of the past took hold of me again. I couldn't contain the anxiety that was growing in my chest. A few days passed, and I tried to return to my usual rhythm of life, but nothing helped. Sleep became unbearable. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, this little man standing in the corner. I felt his presence, his gaze. He was near, despite all my attempts to forget. At some point, I realized that I couldn't escape. This nightmare wouldn't end until I figured out what had happened. Who was he? Why was he following me? And what did he want? These questions tormented me, but there were no answers. Every step I took became more and more hazy, and I lost touch with reality. He was watching me, and I couldn't stop it. A few days had passed since I had seen him again. The little man standing in a dark corner. He was back, and I could no longer escape the thought. He followed me like a shadow that could not be driven away. Nothing helped. I tried to forget myself and work, in endless hours on my knees in front of the computer, but it was useless. Every night I woke up with the feeling that something was wrong. Something was close. I remembered how, as a child, I tried to forget about him, how I thought it was all just a figment of my imagination, that it was just an experience. But now that I was an adult, I knew it was not just an imagination. He was real, and his presence haunted me. I decided to go back to the house where it all started. I needed to understand what was happening. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt like if I didn't go there, I wouldn't be able to move on. Maybe it was a mistake, but I needed answers. It wasn't just fear. It was necessity. I had to figure out what was happening to my life. When I approached the house, it looked just as I remembered it, old and neglected. But now, as I stood next to it, it seemed even more gloomy than it had when I was a child. The darkness that surrounded the place seemed impenetrable. I didn't know what I was looking for, but every instinct I had told me was that I shouldn't go in. However, I knew that I couldn't move on if I didn't. I stepped onto the porch, the creak of the door echoing in the emptiness. It was dark inside, and the air felt heavy, as if the house had been empty of life for a long time. I stepped inside, not knowing what awaited me. Images came to mind, moments from my childhood, memories of old days when everything seemed normal, when I didn't know I'd be standing here in this place, trying to reclaim forgotten fragments of my life. The creak of the floorboards under my feet was sharp and painfully familiar. I walked down the hallway, trying not to look at the corners. However, I felt like something was watching me. The feeling was so strong that I couldn't shake it off, no matter how hard I tried. I stopped at the old door that had once been the door to my room. It was open and dark inside. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt like I had to go in. I took a step and the door closed behind me. Inside, I felt the dark shadows of the past surrounding me. The room I remembered was completely different. The walls were covered in mold, and the air was damp and stale. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, but I wasn't afraid. I stood in the chaos, trying to figure out what I was supposed to find here. What did he want, this little man? Why had he been watching me all these years? In the corner, on an old dresser, I noticed some photographs. I walked up to them, and my heart sank. They were old pictures of my family, but one of them showed the same little man I had seen all these years ago. He was standing in front of my house, in the same place where I had first noticed him, smiling. His long fingers were reaching for the camera, as if he knew he was being photographed. I picked up the photograph and looked at it in disbelief. It was proof that he had always been there. He wasn't just watching me, he was part of my past. I didn't know what to make of this revelation. All I knew was that now I had to figure out what he wanted from me. Suddenly, I felt something moving behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. Just a shadow dancing on the walls and a strange sound like someone walking on an old wooden board. My heart started beating faster. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. He was here. I turned sharply and ran towards the exit. But for a moment it seemed as if time slowed down. Everything around me became unclear, as if I was immersed in some kind of fog. And then I saw him, a small man. He was standing in the doorway, his long fingers reaching out to me, and his face was hidden in shadow. I didn't know what to do. I felt like my body was not obeying me, and I was frozen, unable to move. The little man stepped forward. I saw his face. It was distorted, as if he was in some kind of pain, but his eyes were full of expectation. He was not angry, but his presence was unbearable. It was something from another world, something that could not be explained. "You can't run away," a voice said in my head, and I realized it wasn't me who was thinking it. It was him. I took a step back, but his presence filled the space. I couldn't breathe. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't leave this world until I figured out what was going on. This little man wasn't just part of my past, he was the key to solving it, and only I could solve this mystery. Story 3, it was past midnight and I was alone in the house. No guests, no loud parties or meetings with friends, just me in an empty house. My parents had gone to visit relatives and I was given complete freedom. I hadn't been this alone for a long time. In those moments when the house is quiet and everything around seems calm, it's strange to feel how everything is going on behind the doors. But I was quite comfortable in my solitary silence as usual. I was sitting on the couch, half covered with a blanket, scrolling through YouTube. The TV screen lit the room with a soft glow as I turned off all the other lights, enjoying the evening alone. I knew I wasn't expecting anyone, and I wasn't going to text anyone. I was just relaxing. As time went on, I began to feel my tired body gradually relaxing, and my thoughts slowly getting lost in this absorbed light. I tried to remember what else I needed to do, but I couldn't. All I knew was that I was here and now, alone in this house, completely surrounded by my own silence. Like many people, I often remain in such moments, as if this were my own private world, where no one can distract me, disturb me, or tell me that I need to do something. On such evenings, I feel that the life around me fades into the background, and I remain just an observer. Then my phone vibrated. I didn't notice it right away, but it was loud enough to make me look away from the screen. It was a blue bubble on the iMessage screen. It took me a moment to figure out who it was from, because the number was unfamiliar. The area code was 406, Montana. It didn't make sense to me. I didn't know anyone who lived in Montana. I didn't even know anyone who had any connection to the state. To my surprise, the message had no words, no explanation or context, just an attached file. I brought the phone closer to my face and held my breath as I clicked on it. The preview image looked familiar for a moment, but how? I couldn't figure out where I could see this picture from. It was a map. Well, an image of a map, but it was a map with my house marked on it. My house. I froze, holding the phone to my face, trying to figure out what was going on. My stomach twisted and my breathing became heavy. I sat in the shadows, staring at the screen. Why my house? How could anyone know where I lived? I was used to the calm, but something didn't add up now. Who could it be? I tried to force myself to think logically, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to explain it all. I sat there in complete silence. For hours, if not longer, I would not have been able to force myself to get up or move. Right in front of me on the screen was a dot, my house. I got up from the couch and turned on all the lights in the house, ran my eyes over the empty walls, but the house was too quiet. I did not know what to do with this message. What kind of joke was this? Or a mistake? Perhaps just a wrong number. I was confused, not knowing how to react. Should I write a reply? Or ignore and forget? However, fear was slowly creeping up on me. I picked up the phone again and without thinking wrote a simple word. Who is this? I expected some kind of answer, some kind of explanation, something that could calm me down, but it didn't happen. There was no answer. Just 3 dots that first started to appear and then disappeared. I waited a little longer, looking at the screen, but nothing changed. Realizing that there was nothing more to wait for, I froze. I didn't know what to do. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was just a glitch. But then a new message arrived. You always sit in the same place? My heart started beating fast. I instantly felt my stomach tighten with fear. No explanation, no further words, just that. I felt uneasy, as if there was someone in the room, but I couldn't see them. I looked around, but the house was still quiet. I sat down on the couch again, feeling my hands start to sweat. I didn't know what to do next, but thoughts started to torment me. Why were they texting me? How was this possible? That number and his strange message. Everything was so close, so uncertain. My hand tightened on the phone, but I couldn't stop. I knew this situation was more than just a mistake. Something was wrong. I knew there was something behind it. Was this a joke or something worse? I thought about it, but I kept looking at the screen. I felt the air around me getting thicker. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts were racing and I was getting nervous. I checked again. The windows were closed. The doors were locked. Everything in the house was as usual. Everything seemed to be in order. But suddenly I had a strange feeling someone was watching me. This number, these strange messages. Instinctively, I returned to the screen and tried to comprehend what was happening again. It was all happening too fast. And no matter how hard I tried to calm myself down, I knew something was wrong. Something was behind that message. A click that made me feel like I couldn't escape it. I couldn't just leave it like that. The desire to figure it out, to understand what was happening, was growing inside me with every passing moment. I looked at the phone again, trying to calm the nervous tension that was growing inside me. The clock was ticking on the wall, and each sound was getting louder, as if something invisible was approaching. I didn't know what or how to do, but I felt that this message was not just a mistake. It was a warning. And what awaited me was something bigger and more sinister. The room was too quiet. Even the sounds of ordinary objects, like the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the other room, became sharp and distinct. I felt the walls begin to close in, the air became heavy. I stood up and went to the window. Beyond it was complete darkness. No sounds, nothing that could give away the presence of someone else. Just a cold night, dotted only with stars and dark silhouettes of trees that trembled in the wind. I turned away and looked at my phone again. There were no new messages on the screen. I began to doubt whether I was doing the right thing by continuing to delve into this. Maybe it would be better to just turn off the phone and forget about it all. But then why did this feeling of anxiety not leave me? I felt my hands begin to shake. The same 3 dots began to appear on the screen again. It was like someone was typing in standby mode but couldn't decide to send. Then the screen filled up with words again. You are not alone. My heart skipped a beat. That phrase couldn't have been accidental. I felt the cold beginning to creep into every cell of my body. The feeling that I wasn't alone in the house was becoming more and more distinct, as if in the corner of the room, in a dark, unlit place, someone was simply waiting. I tried to brush it off, but it came back to me again and again. I immediately started checking what was going on. Grabbing the keys, I checked all the doors. They were locked, just like the windows. I walked around the house, turning over every corner, every closet, but I found nothing strange. Only emptiness, only silence, only my breathing, which was becoming louder and louder. I walked back into the living room and looked at my phone again. I kept watching the screen, hoping that this was just some stupid game or a mistake. But no matter how hard I tried to find an explanation, my body couldn't shake the feeling of unease. This message was real. It was real. And whoever was behind it knew about my house. He knew about me. Knew where I was. And again, a new message. You didn't notice him, did you? I froze, unsure of how to react. Who wrote this? Who knew what I was thinking, what I was going through? I tried to push the thought away, but it was firmly lodged in my head. It was as if someone was there, but hiding. Something invisible was following me. I could feel its presence. It was real and unnoticeable, like a shadow that leaves no trace. Doubt and fear were not leaving me. I looked at the screen and saw how the next 3 dots slowly began to disappear, as if someone had started to erase the message. I quickly tried to write a reply. What do you want from me? The 3 dots returned. I waited, but there was no answer. Silence filled the space again. I was alone, but I didn't feel alone. The anxiety grew brighter with each passing second, as if it were consuming me. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. Suddenly, I noticed a new file on the screen. It was a photograph. It was so unexpected and strange that I almost dropped the phone. It was a photograph of my house, taken from the very corner where my desk stood. Only the house was not as I had left it. Everything was dark, as if something was hiding in the night. The shadow in the photograph looked crooked, as if someone was standing in the very corner of my yard watching the house. It wasn't just a snapshot, it was something else. It felt like someone was seeing me. I stood there, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. My thoughts were all jumbled up, like I was trapped. The more I thought about it, the more eerie it became. I knew that this photo wasn't just a coincidence. It was a sign that someone was there, watching me. And even if I couldn't see them, I knew they were there. I put the phone down and looked out the window, but there, as before, was only the dark night. Silence. Nothing more. From the moment I saw the photograph, all my confidence in being safe crumbled like a house of cards. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every movement, every sound, even the shadows cast by the trees outside the window seemed ominous. I couldn't figure out if this was just someone playing a prank, a joke, or if there was something bigger going on that I couldn't comprehend. I picked up my phone again and checked all my messages. Several minutes had passed, and there was nothing new. And yet I could feel the tension tightening in my muscles, the air growing thicker. I couldn't just sit there and wait for the next message, the next shock. I had to do something. Deciding that I needed to calm down somehow, I got up from the floor and started walking around the house. It wasn't the most logical decision, but I was trying to find some kind of justification for my behavior. I checked all the doors and windows as if I was trying to make sure that I really wasn't alone in the house. Everything was as it should be, locked, in order, no signs of anyone breaking into the house. But the more I thought about it, the more I doubted that I would be able to forget everything so easily. I walked back to my room, looking around warily. When I looked at my phone again, I noticed the screen had gone dark, as if I had missed something. There was a new message, again from the same number. I froze, holding my breath for a second. My fingers shook as I tapped the screen. You can't see me, but I'm here. This message knocked me off my feet. I didn't even know what to think. I didn't know what to do with it. Who could be following me so precisely and persistently? Why didn't they just come and tell me what they wanted? Why did they send such cryptic messages? A photo, Directions that clearly said they knew about my home, about my life, about where I was. The dot on the screen updated again. It had moved, and now it was much closer. I looked at the map. The location was about 10 minutes from my house. It was moving, continuing along the same route that I knew. It was strange because I knew every street, every road in the area. But this time, I wasn't sure where the person who was following me was. I jumped up and ran around the house again, checking every door and window. It felt like I was doing it for the 100th time, but I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety that came over me with every movement of that red marker on the map. My house felt strange. I didn't feel at home. I went back to my room, looked around again, and suddenly noticed how dark it was outside the window. The streets were empty. The houses were all in darkness. I felt the cold grip me when I noticed that the dot on the screen was moving again. It was heading straight for my house. And then I realized that despite all my checks, I was not sure of my condition. It seemed to me all the time that someone was nearby, but at some point I realized that this feeling did not go away. I could no longer sit in this room where everything was starting to lose reality. I went to the window and looked out. In the dark sky, among the old trees, I could not see anything suspicious. But at that moment, as if by an obsession, I felt this presence again. My phone vibrated again. I jumped in surprise. I already knew what it was, a new file. I pressed myself into the corner of the window, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. A photograph. The picture was taken from the other side, this time directly in front of my window, at an angle I couldn't see from where I was. The picture showed only my house in the dark. But this picture wasn't like the one I'd seen before. It was even closer, as if someone was standing right in front of my windows watching me. A strong sense of paranoia came over me. I stepped back from the window, but I couldn't take my eyes off the phone. I didn't know what to do. And worst of all, I didn't know what would happen next. I couldn't wait any longer. I called the police again, hoping that at least they could calm me down. The number didn't come through as quickly as usual. I felt my hands shaking. The police answered and I started talking. I told them about the messages, the pictures, and that someone was watching me. But their response was cold and distant. I realized that they could not understand the seriousness of the situation. They promised to patrol again, but gave no specifics. My phone went silent again. The dot moved again, and I no longer knew what to fear more, this man or what I would feel until the morning. I was left alone in a dark room where every noise seemed incredibly loud to me, and the shadow outside the window was no longer just dark, but filled with something unknown that could be nearby. I didn't know what to do. My thoughts were all jumbled up, and the fear was growing heavier with each passing moment, like something physical pressing on my chest. I could feel it in every cell of my body, in every breath, in every movement. I looked around, trying to find some sort of foothold, anything that could give me back control of the situation. But everything seemed foreign, alien, as if I wasn't in my home, but in some alien reality where every corner was a threat. The strong smell of pine trees that was always outside seemed unbearable now. It was as if the air outside was somehow altered, saturated with something I couldn't place. I glanced at my phone again. No new messages. But the fact that it was still there was terribly unsettling. I started pacing the room, not knowing why I was doing it. Maybe I was trying to create an illusion of safety, or maybe I was looking for something that could distract me from this feeling of paranoia. I opened the closet, sorted through the things, but found nothing that could calm me down. Eventually, I returned to the window and looked out into the night again. The dark outlines of the trees and the empty streets created a frightening silence. I was alone. This feeling of loneliness and helplessness made me lose the last of my strength. I could go outside and check what was happening, but the idea of leaving the house only increased my fear. I didn't know what was waiting for me outside. I didn't know what was waiting for me in the dark. But then I heard a strange sound. It wasn't loud, but I noticed it right away. A knock on the window. It wasn't some random sound. I froze, peering into the darkness. It was as if someone was slowly knocking on the glass, unhurriedly but insistently. My heart started beating faster, and I felt goosebumps run down my spine. I went to the window, trying to make sure I wasn't imagining things. In the darkness, I couldn't see anything except the slight vibrations of the tree branches, which moved slightly in the gusts of wind. But the knocking repeated itself. It was clear and almost rhythmic, as if someone was standing outside the window and tapping a finger on the glass. I recoiled. This couldn't just be an accident. This was intentional, and I needed to find out who it was. I grabbed the car keys and ran to the door. My body was tense, like I was on the verge of doing something, not knowing if it would be the right decision. However, it was too late to undo anything. I opened the door, slamming it behind me. It was dark outside, but while I felt like I was in an open space, it didn't make me feel safe. The trees I'd always considered part of the landscape now seemed like huge, ominous silhouettes, hiding something inside them. The knocking on the window continued. I couldn't figure out what to do. My mind was clouded. I just moved in the direction of the sound. Every step I took echoed in the silence. The night seemed pitch black and I felt helpless, as if I was being pulled into a trap where I couldn't change anything. As I got closer, I saw that the window on the first floor was indeed open. It was slightly open, and this strange knocking was coming from there. I stopped, frozen for a moment, feeling the air around me become cold and heavy. I looked inside and was literally pierced by emptiness. The room was dark. I couldn't see any shadows, no sign that anyone could be inside. But something about that empty window made me feel like something was wrong. I wanted to go inside, but something was holding me back. My thoughts began to get confused again. The fear became unbearable. I didn't know where to go, what to do, how to behave. This place was my home, but now it seemed hostile, and I was a stranger within these walls. I peered into the darkness, trying to see any sign of a presence. And then, in the shadows, I saw a figure. It was like a mirage. At first it seemed part of the shadows, and then it became clear. A man, not quite a man, more of a silhouette. I froze, unable to move. He stood there in the shadows, and it seemed as if he was watching me, but he did not move. I felt his presence, although I could not even make out his features. I didn't know what to do, and suddenly everything went quiet. The knocking stopped. My breathing became hoarse and tense. At that very second, I felt something inside me explode. I turned around and ran back into the house without looking back. I ran into the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my eyes couldn't stop moving around the house, as if I was trying to see something lurking in the darkness. I didn't know what it was. A shadow, a figure in the window. It could just be my mind distorting reality. But something inside me wouldn't let me calm down. This feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching me, became unbearable. Turning on the light in the room, I tried to collect my thoughts. My hands were still shaking. I checked my phone again. No new messages. But I knew that the man was somewhere nearby. I could feel it. He was close. Just like that moment when I looked out the window and saw the shadow. Maybe it wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe all of this was planned to make me feel helpless, so that I couldn't find any way out. I started walking around the room, checking every corner. My behavior seemed strange to me, but I couldn't help this feeling that something or someone was hiding here, in this house. I went to every window, looked at the door, checked the closets and corners. It seemed like I could find something that would help me understand what was going on. Suddenly, my gaze stopped on the old mirror in the hallway. It wasn't very big, but I always felt that it was strange. I couldn't say exactly why, but when I looked into it, it always seemed to me that there was something wrong with the reflection. And now, this feeling came back to me again. Walking up to the mirror, I looked at my reflection. Everything was as usual. I stood there, staring at myself tensely, but at the same time, everything around me seemed to be slightly distorted, as if reality around me was beginning to melt. It was hard to explain why I felt this way, but with each passing moment the feeling grew stronger. I took a step back, trying to return to normality, and suddenly from the corner of the mirror, as if in its very center, I noticed movement. It was too fast and too strange to be an ordinary reflection. A moment, and I saw a figure appear in the reflection in the mirror. I froze, but I could not look away. At first it seemed to be just part of the shadow, but the next moment I realized that this was not just a trick of the light. The figure in the mirror was dark and hazy like smoke, but with a distinct human form. I tried to move away, but my feet were rooted to the floor. The figure was getting closer, and in that moment I realized that it was not just a reflection. It was something that existed in this space, in this reality, and as if its presence violated the normal laws. I felt a chill fill the air, and my breath began to struggle through my constricting lungs. I tore myself away from the mirror with difficulty and noticed with horror that the figure had not disappeared. It continued to move, now not only in the reflection, but in the room itself. I picked up the phone again and looked at it, hoping that it would help me return to reality. However, as soon as I looked at the screen, I saw a new message from the same number. "You saw me?" It was so strange that I literally felt goosebumps running down my skin. With each passing moment, the feeling of horror became more and more intense, and I didn't know what to do. Everything seemed like some kind of nightmare that didn't stop, but only became more vivid, more real. I looked at the mirror again and noticed the figure starting to move towards me, slowly but steadily getting closer. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't just stand there and watch. I had to do something, and I decided that I had to get out of here. I turned and ran towards the exit, not daring to look back. The door was only a few steps away, but it seemed to move away from me with each step. There was only one thought in my head: to get outside, to get out of this nightmare, and then to find someone who could explain to me what was happening. When I finally reached the door and opened it, cold air rushed into the room, but it did not help. I quickly looked back and saw the door close behind me with a bang, but the street was dark and empty. I ran around the yard, feeling my legs losing strength. At that moment, I realized that I could not just run away. I went back into the house and closed the doors again. This time I felt like the move I had made was not just an escape, but an attempt to regain control. I didn't know how long this nightmare would last, but I needed answers. I sat on the floor in a dark room, surrounded by a silence that seemed almost tangible. My thoughts raged in my head, but they could not find a way out. I tried to understand what was happening, what kind of terrible dream this was, but I could not find a logical explanation. Every movement I made, every glance into the dark emptiness was like under a microscope, and I felt the tension growing with each passing second. My fingers couldn't stop shaking as I looked at my phone again. It all seemed unbearably strange and ridiculous, but I kept checking my messages anyway. Maybe I was hoping that someone, anyone, could explain to me what was going on. But there was nothing new on the screen. Everything was the same, all the same information, a number I didn't recognize, a dot on the map that was moving, and these words, "You can see me now." That's all. I lost track of time, standing frozen in the room, as if waiting for something to change. On the screen, everything was still, but there was a strange menace in the air that was haunting me. I could feel it physically, as if something was watching me, was close, but would not let itself be seen. Taking a few deep breaths, I decided to try again, to try to find some explanation for what was happening. If this wasn't a mistake, if this wasn't just someone acting up, then there had to be something more. I opened the Find My app and saw that same dot on the map again. It wasn't moving anymore. It was just standing there, right in front of my house. I didn't know what to do. The moment was so absurd that I felt my thoughts begin to tangle. And then, as if reality itself was about to break, I saw something else on the screen. A new message came at the very moment I was staring at the map. It was one word: go. What does this mean? Who could have sent this? My heart started pounding again. I felt a chill run down my spine, and everything inside me told me I needed to take action. But what if I was doing it wrong? What if every step I took only brought me closer to something I couldn't understand or survive? I knew I couldn't be left alone, and I couldn't just sit there, feeling something coming towards me. I got up from the floor, walked away from the window, and approached the door that led to the corridor. But as soon as I opened it, it seemed to me that the air became even heavier. I felt something unknown pressing on me, on my shoulders, as if I was surrounded by an invisible wall. I took a few steps, but inside me there was a growing feeling that I had become part of some strange experiment, a victim of someone's observation. Not knowing where to go, I knelt down in the hallway and checked the door to the backyard. Everything was quiet, strangely quiet. I listened, but there was no sound. No cars, no footsteps. But that wasn't normal. The entire silence around me felt alien. I glanced at my phone again. There was a single message on the screen: "You're here." Nothing was happening, but I felt something watching me, felt it getting closer with each passing moment. I didn't know what was coming next. All I knew was that I was in the middle of something I couldn't understand and couldn't control, and I probably couldn't get out of it, even if I wanted to. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I didn't know what was happening to it, what this presence was, but everything inside me screamed that I needed to get out. I checked the locks on the doors again, every door, every window, but it didn't bring me peace. There were only two thoughts spinning in my head: why me? And who is this? I heard footsteps, quiet at first, but they became louder and louder, as if someone was walking in my direction. It was some kind of heavy, confident step. I jumped up and turned around, but there was nothing. No people, no sounds. Everything was quiet, as if they had stopped, disappeared. But then I saw him, a man standing in the doorway, on the other side. He stood there, motionless, just watching. Static, unmoving. I couldn't see his face, just a silhouette, in the darkness and the shadows of the night. But I knew it wasn't just a man. It was someone who had been watching me, someone who had been with me all this time. He was nearby,